Welcome to the last session before lunch and the best one of the morning. My name is James Crabtree. I run the International Institute for Strategic Studies here in Singapore, and it's my great pleasure to be acting as the fireside moderator for my good friend and former boss, Kishore Mahbubani. Kishore, I'm sure many of you will know, is a multiply published author, one of Singapore's leading public intellectuals, and he also used to be the dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and was kind enough to give me a job there, so I have to ask him nice questions. Let's start. We're going to do half an hour before lunch, a brief canter through the current geopolitical scene. Kishore, you just came back from Bali, where you were at the G20 meeting, or the run-up to the G20 meeting. I'd like to talk a little bit about what you learned when you were there, but maybe we start with the obvious question about the meeting yesterday between Xi and Biden. It seems to have been reasonably constructive. Where do you think that leaves ties between the United States and China?
Yeah. Well, thank you, James, for that very warm welcome. But on the Xi-Biden meeting, the result has been rather paradoxical, because on the one hand, everything changed in US-China relations, and on the other hand, nothing changed in US-China relations. And let me explain what I mean by this paradox. On the one hand, everything changed because for us now, finally, after 2 years of the Biden administration, you're having a civilized dialogue between the United States and China. And they can talk and communicate with one another. You remember how Alaska started, how they shouted at each other, they exchanged insults, and they just couldn't even have a proper conversation. And in all these years, even though Blinken and Jake Sullivan have met their counterparts, there's been no real communication. But I think after the Xi-Biden meeting, you're now going to get real communication. And I suspect we've also helped to moderate some of the most dangerous points in the US-China relationship, which of course is the Taiwan issue. And I think President Biden's reaffirmation that the US hasn't changed its one China policy is very, very important, that kind of direct assurance. So that's how everything has changed. But at the same time, I also say that nothing has changed because actually the US campaign to bring down China and to stop China's rise is not going to decrease in the next 10 years, it's going to increase. So even though they had a very nice, friendly meeting, the fundamental goal of the United States to stop China from becoming #1 is not going to diminish in any way. And as you saw this, of course, with the CHIPS Act that has just come, but there'll be more and more measures that the United States will take to try and slow down China's economic growth. So that will also continue. So that's what I mean by saying nothing has changed.
So if you're sitting in a room like this or a conference like this and you're looking to put money to work in Asia and you're slightly worried about the way in which geopolitics might affect this, thinking about the ruptures after Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, and it sounds like you're saying expect more of this in future. Don't be fooled by the positive tone of the Bali meeting. Really, it's more likely that we're going to see more US-China tension and potentially more crises between the two powers. Is that a fair assumption?
I think you will definitely see more tension, more competition between the two. But you know, geopolitical contests provide dangers, but they also provide opportunities. And so for Southeast Asia, for example, ASEAN, as you know, has gone through various phases of being loved and snubbed by the great powers. During the Cold War, everybody fell in love with ASEAN. After the end of the Cold War, people said ASEAN didn't matter. Now ASEAN matters again. And so the courtship of ASEAN by various powers will increase in the next 10 years. And that will provide, I think, significant growth opportunities for the ASEAN countries. Certainly China will come and do more with the region. And as you know, China's, if you look just at this one simple statistic, in the year 2000, United States trade with ASEAN was $135 billion, more than 3 times China's trade of $40 billion. Today, United States trade has gone up 2.5 times to about 300 plus billion. But China's trade with ASEAN has gone to over 800 billion, an increase of 20 times in 20 years. So that is an example of how you will see greater opportunities coming this way. So in terms of economic growth and development, particularly with the takeoff of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, I've actually become more bullish about the prospects for the regional economy in East Asia.
So for those of you who haven't read them, Kishore has written 2 recent books, one, The Rise of the Asian Century, a collection of essays, another which is called Has China Won? Provocatively, which came out last year or the year before. We can talk about that in a minute, but just to stay on the sort of the question of Taiwan, it's an obvious question to ask, but what is the outlook there? If you are looking at it from the United States, you're worried that China is going to invade. If you're looking at it from China, you're worried that the US is going to try and push Taiwan towards independence. What's the outlook? What do you think will happen over the next couple of years?
Well, I think Taiwan will always remain very dangerous. And it's very clear that there's one thing that could cause a war between the United States and China. It is Taiwan. Because if Taiwan declares independence, China will declare war. That's 100% certainty. And for a while, I mean, especially after the Pelosi visit, there was some fears, I think, in Beijing that the US was trying to push China towards independence. But I think the recent meeting between Xi and Biden, the one thing it has done is brought the temperature down on Taiwan. And it's very significant, by the way, that both sides said that there'll be no nuclear war. And then you do your calculations. If you have a conventional war over Taiwan, who's in a better position? Who's nearer? Who's further? And so I think in that sense, I suspect that the Taiwan issue, there'll be a calming process, because I suspect that the Biden administration did all their calculations and came to the conclusion a war over Taiwan would be just too painful, too dangerous. Let's just calm that issue down. And instead of using Taiwan as a way of, as a foil against China, they're now going to use technology as a foil against China. And you saw that in the CHIPS Act. You'll see, I predict with some certainty, various other advanced technologies that the United States has, the taps will be shut one by one. And they've decided that that's the way to slow China down.
And I suppose that has significant implications for this region and investment in the region. Let me take you back to your travels, because Kishore is a very well-traveled man, and he's been on some interesting adventures recently. So let's stick with Bali for the moment. So you met Indonesia's President Jokowi, Indonesian Foreign Minister Retno. What did you glean from talking to the leadership in Southeast Asia about how they are viewing not just US-China, but also, if we introduce the third leg of the triangle, namely Russia, and the way in which Indonesia had to cope with the fact that the 3 big powers are in different ways in a sort of bad state with one another?
Well, I mean, I was very fortunate. I had breakfast with President Jokowi on Wednesday. I had lunch with the Indonesian Foreign Minister on Tuesday. And I also actually had lunch with Minister Luhut, who, as you know, is one of the heavyweight ministers in the Indonesian government. I think as far as Indonesia was concerned last week, what they wanted to avoid was a disastrous outcome for the G20 meeting. And in fact, frankly, logically, the G20 meeting that is just finishing should have failed, you know. Should have failed. There should have been walkouts. There should have been angry statements. Instead, as you know, there was actually overall a relatively positive meeting between Xi and Biden. No fireworks at the G20 meeting. And just to give you a small example, when President Xi and Prime Minister Modi of India met recently, a few weeks ago, at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting in Samarkand, they didn't even shake hands. There was a certain coolness. But in Bali, they shook hands. So I think what the Indonesians are really good at doing is creating the right atmosphere for positive outcomes. And the Indonesians, I can tell you, had very frank exchanges with the European delegates. And they told the European delegates, yes, we know you're going to criticize Russia. That's a given. You have to criticize Russia over its invasion of Ukraine. But please, no walkouts. Those walkouts are insult to the host. Stay in the meeting and participate in the dialogue. So you can see how they thought very hard about that. And also, President Jokowi told me, he said, I think that President Xi and Joe Biden will have a good meeting because I gave them the nicest room in Bali for the meeting. And he chose a room with a very nice view and everything, So you can see, therefore, that the Indonesians paid a lot of care and attention to ensuring that the G20 meeting in Indonesia will go down as one of the most successful G20 meetings. So at a time when the G20's fortunes were going down, Indonesia helped to turn it around a bit.
That's a nice positive take, I think. I want to come back to Russia, but you had one other trip recently. As I say, Kishore is often to be found in different parts of the globe. So you were in Paris, where you met President Macron. So you mentioned the role that the Europeans have played in Bali and the radicalization of mainstream European opinion with respect to Ukraine and Russia. What did you learn in Paris about where Europe stands on this?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's very unusual for me to spend 1 week with two presidents. Wednesday, breakfast with President Jokowi, Friday, dinner with President Macron, and I must say, President Macron was very nice to me. He said that when he was a young man, his assignment was to translate my essays into French, so he knew my work. And I think that's why he invited me. But his focus clearly is on the global multilateral picture. And I think President Macron knows this is his second term. He's not going to be re-elected. I'm sure he's thinking a bit about his legacy. What is the legacy he's going to leave behind? And I know he genuinely believes in multilateralism. So he wants to, in a sense, strengthen global multilateral institutions. But I can tell you, in the panel discussion, what really surprised me was that the President Macron invited the President of Argentina, the President of Guinea-Bissau, the Prime Minister of Albania, and the head of World Food Programme, the head of International Crisis Group, and a young UAE novelist who's 26 years old. And what was stunning is that the heads of government, when they spoke, they all criticized Western policy on Ukraine. And I was stunned. I said, wow, President Macron is not bringing in people who is going to support what Europe is doing on Russia and Ukraine. In fact, the president of Argentina was very categorical. He said, this war in Ukraine is not just hurting the people of Ukraine. Yes, the people of Ukraine are dying. We feel their pain. But the global poor, the global south is also suffering. So please, stop the war, right? Let's have negotiations. And that is not, as you know, that's not the dominant view in Europe at all. The view in Europe is to carry on with the war. So this tension in between a world where if you add up the population of all the countries that have imposed sanctions on Russia, it comes to 15% of the world's population. 85% of the world's population has not imposed sanctions on Russia. So that means that there is that tension that will develop between what Europe wants to see as the outcome and what the rest of the world wants to see as the outcome. And that was what, to my surprise, surfaced very clearly at the Paris Peace Forum.
Do you think that's, I mean, it's a challenging point if I imagine many people in the audience here are from Europe or North America, where there is a consensus that Russia's in the wrong, the Ukraine course is a noble one, and the best way to end this war is for Ukraine to win it decisively and to sort of put Russia back in its box. Your sense is that if you look across the sweep of Asia, Africa, Latin America, the global south, as some call it, that is a view that most people disagree with?
Yeah, I would say the view of the global south is very, very clear. And actually the person who's articulated it very well, as you know, is the Foreign Minister of India, Dr. Jaishankar. And Dr. Jaishankar said after visiting Europe, he says, the problem in our world is that Europe thinks that Europe's problems are the world's problems, and the world's problems are not Europe's problems. So, and I think there's a sense that Europe and certainly the West are not paying enough attention to the impact of the war on the rest of the world. And I think if I was a European strategic planner, I would worry about the fact that this might become too much of an issue, not between, in a sense, the rules-based order and Russia on the one hand, but instead just the West and the Russia and the rest of the world saying, let's try to end this. And I don't know whether you saw this. Henry Kissinger just gave an interview where he said that what the world needs to do is have a larger conceptual, theoretical dialogue, both with China and with Russia. And actually, I also met Henry Kissinger, I think in mid-October in New York, one-on-one. And in private, he basically said exactly what he said in public, which is that to deal with the issues of Russia and to deal with the issues of China, it's not about focusing on the one or two, whether the issue is Taiwan, whether the issue is South China Sea, whether the issue is technology. It's about what is a bigger conceptual picture in which you're going to place Russia's long-term role in the world, China's long-term role in the world, and how do you create a world order that in a sense is able to accommodate these powers in such a way that it's a plus for them and frankly a plus for the rest of the world. And I think that's also the big message of my book, As China Won. The world has got to be restructured to accommodate the rise of China.
Just keeping on Russia briefly, so we had the events of this morning, which many in the audience will have looked at. So a stray missile fell in a Polish border town 2 hours north of Lviv and a few miles from the Ukrainian border. It's not yet clear whether this was a Russian missile, well, it was a Russian-made missile, but whether it was fired by the Russians or the Ukrainians. But let's imagine that we discover in the coming day that it probably was a Russian missile, which seems like the most likely outcome. Do you have a sense of how NATO might respond to this? The G7 ministers were meeting today in Bali. What will be the result of a moment in which there has been an, albeit probably accidental, strike against a NATO member?
Well, I think you're right. It's probably an accidental strike. I mean, I actually spent some time in Germany also, actually in September. And what struck me is there's a very strong sense of European unity against this Russian invasion of Ukraine. And actually, it struck me that there's a new sense of solidarity in Europe that has emerged after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So certainly the European response to this even Russian accident will be very negative. But at the same time, there's also a very clear understanding in Europe that it would be a big mistake if you send European soldiers in to fight Russian soldiers. I think that's something that I think they want. They will help Ukraine, and they've been very generous with their assistance of Ukraine, but I don't think they will send in their soldiers to try and go fight with Russia. So I think that's what they will hold back. We have to basically see, I mean, I kept asking several people in Europe, what do you see as the outcome in Ukraine? How is it going to end? I mean, at some point it's going to end. And the general sense I got is that nothing is going to happen till this winter is over. I think both sides are trying to see how this winter will affect Russia and Europe and Ukraine. And probably by early next year, if possible, then you might have some indications of how this will play out. But as of now, clearly the Ukrainians believe that they are winning. And the Ukrainian soldiers have been remarkably brave and capable, I must say. They really fought an amazing war, and they've outperformed against everybody's expectations. And you have to acknowledge that. And therefore, you can understand why the Ukrainians don't want to in any way compromise now. So we have to wait and see, wait a few months to see the outcome.
Very good. We've got about 10 minutes to go, so I'm going to ask a few more questions before we break for lunch. You mentioned the countries that had introduced sanctions against Ukraine, and I suppose I should point out that one of those is our home city of Singapore. I suppose without being too provocative, I should ask, what did you think of the decision of the Singapore government to join the predominantly Western nations that introduced sanctions, and what has been the reaction to that move here in Singapore?
Well, I would say, the non-aligned movement has got, I forget, 150, 160 members. And Singapore is the only member of the non-aligned movement to have imposed sanctions on Russia. So it's obviously a very brave decision on the part of Singapore to stand out and say that we will take a position of principle. And I think so far it's been well received by the people. But at the same time, I think it's also clear that Singapore wants to see a solution to this Ukraine war, because it's clearly destabilizing, not just Europe, it's destabilizing the whole world. And so if there are moves towards a solution, I think Singapore will support it.
Tell me a little bit more about, again, for an audience like this, we're interested in investment and investment opportunities. You have mentioned technology and technology bifurcation in the aftermath of the US Commerce Department October 7th semiconductor regulations. What is your outlook on the economic picture for this region in Asia? Are we heading inexorably for a divided Asia in which you have a Chinese system on the one hand and then a like-minded system that links up the United States and Japan and the Republic of Korea and Australia? And what would that mean for Southeast Asia caught in the middle?
Well, I think it's very early in the game. We have to wait and see what other technology measures the United States is going to carry out against China. I know for sure there'll be more. But at the same time, I think the United States will find it very difficult to decouple from China, because they'll find with China getting more integrated with not just East Asia, with the rest of the world, a decoupling between US and China may mean a decoupling between US and the world. And I can tell you, just 2 nights ago, I was on a panel with the Foreign Minister of South Africa and the former Foreign Minister of Brazil, Celso Amorim. And Celso Amorim, as you know, is a supporter of President Lula. And Celso Amorim said, listen, I mean, look at the amount of trade that Brazil does with United States, right? Brazil's trade with China, I think, is 3 times. Brazil's trade with United States. Trade with China is 3 times the trade with the United States. And you know, 20 years ago, it took Brazil 1 year to export $1 billion to China. Now it takes Brazil 72 hours to export $1 billion to China. So Celso Amorim said that if you look at Argentina and the other states, China is a much bigger trader for them. So therefore, the integration between China and the rest of the world, I actually predict, will gain pace as soon as the COVID-19 zero COVID policy is lifted. I predict that it will be lifted slowly, gradually, step by step in the next 6 to 12 months. But once China lifts its zero COVID policy, China's trade with the rest of the world is going to bounce back significantly. And as the United States tries to decouple with China, it suddenly finds, hey, this is a problem. China is so integrated with the rest of the world, how do I decouple avoid decoupling from the rest of the world. So this is why I think, as you know, Singapore is a very good friend of the United States. And we want the United States to do well. We want the United States to stay on in this region. But we want the United States to also acknowledge there's some realities in this region. And one of the realities in Southeast Asia and East Asia is don't ask any country in this region to choose between China and choose within the United States, because nobody wants to choose. And therefore, when the United States carries out its actions like decoupling, it's got to really figure out what is the long-term strategic game plan. And the Chinese, I know, have a long-term strategic game plan. But the United States is still very unclear what that long-term strategic game plan is.
Let me ask you a couple of questions to close. So firstly, on China, many in the audience will have been watching carefully the events of the National Party Congress, which happened a few weeks ago. In the biased Western media, the general view was that this was a hardline shift, that those who were put on the standing committee were loyalists to Xi rather than those who were more associated with different parts of the Chinese political ecosystem or who were seen to be economic reformers, and that therefore we can expect China under the third term of President Xi to move in a particular direction. You, certainly compared to the prevailing narrative in the West, have been a sympathetic observer or critic of China in your books. So what's your outlook for what we can expect from Xi's third term?
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. There's a rock-solid consensus. I would say more in the Anglo-Saxon media than the Western media, because when I go to Germany, I find the German view is a bit more nuanced. I mean, you saw the fact that Chancellor Scholz just went to China against the explicit lobbying of Washington, D.C., in fact, against the lobbying by some of his European counterparts. He went to China. So I think the German position on China is different in some ways. So I would say it's the Anglo-Saxon media that has reached a very clear consensus that President Xi Jinping has made a huge mistake. He's accumulated too much power for himself, and instead of appointing competent, pragmatic ministers or officials, he's now appointed loyalists, and these loyalists cannot say no to Xi Jinping, and therefore the China growth story is over. I mean, I'm exaggerating a bit, but that's a story. So, and yeah, you're right, I hold a different point of view. I actually believe that President Xi realizes that the next 10 years of China's history will go down as among the most decisive 10 years of China's history ever. Because he knows that in the next 10 years, the United States will try to do its best to slow down China, and he's going to make sure that the slowdown doesn't succeed and that China keeps growing. And how does China keep growing? It has to open up to the world. If China closes itself, the growth story is over. If China wants the economy to open, it's got to open it up. And so I predict that it is right that he's surrounded by loyalists, but it is also probable that he's surrounded by competent loyalists. And just to give you an example, the number 2 guy, Li Qiang, he was, as you all know, party secretary of Shanghai. There are 3 things you ought to know about him. The hometown that he comes from is one of China's most entrepreneurial hometowns. Number 2, he's the one who helped Jack Ma and Alibaba when he was party secretary. Number 3, he's the guy who negotiated with Elon Musk the Tesla manufacturing plant in Shanghai. So the business people who know Li Qiang know that he's pro-business and not an ideological party hack, which is what the impression that is given in the Anglo-Saxon media. So we live in a very interesting world because it's very clear what the Anglo-Saxon media is saying, and of course, it may be proven right, but I believe that view is wrong, and that it come next year as China lifts its zero COVID. Actually, the biggest dampener on China's growth today is the zero COVID policy, because they can't open up the country yet. But once they lift that, you'll see a bounce back that will be significant.
Very good. Well, a note of optimism on which to end. We've talked about the G20, Biden and Xi, Xi's outlook, Russia, the war in Ukraine, and much else besides. It's always a pleasure. You can get Kishore's most recent book, The Rise of the Asian Century, and the one before that, which is called Has China Won, in any good bookshop or online. And I'd invite you to give Kishore a warm round of applause and enjoy lunch. Thank you very much.